In May 1979, inside the quiet luxury suite of the Four Seasons Hotel in Los Angeles, a 66-year-old woman took her last breath. There were no cries of mourning from her children, no warm hand to hold from any husband, and not a single confidant by her bedside. Her funeral was attended by a mere 16 people. The most heartbreaking part is that this woman, who died in isolation with less than $3,500 to her name, once held one of the greatest fortunes in American history. She was Barbara Woolworth Hutton. For Americans who lived through the 20th century, the name Woolworth was not just a brand. It was a piece of memory for an entire generation. The downfall of Barbara carries a bitterly ironic paradox. The massive fortune she inherited did not come from oil wells or high-tech inventions. It was built from the 5 and 10-cent coins of the working poor. Her grandfather, Frank Winfield Woolworth, was a commercial genius who rose from nothing. By opening a chain of 5 and 10-cent retail stores, he sold the most ordinary goods to millions of Americans, saving every single cent to build a commercial empire and the proud Woolworth skyscraper in the heart of New York. That great-grandfather used spare change to buy the world, but ironically, his little granddaughter used that nearly $1 billion fortune to desperately buy the one thing his stores never sold: love. Barbara was born on the 14th of November, 1912, carrying the blood of two of the most powerful financial dynasties in America. Her mother, Edna, was the beloved daughter of the Woolworth Empire. Her father, Franklin Laws Hutton, was the co-founder of one of the most prestigious investment banks on Wall Street. From the moment she let out her first cry, fate had rolled out a golden carpet at her feet. However, behind the closed doors of the elite, the little girl lived a life completely starved of affection. The event that shaped the entire psychological tragedy of her life occurred on a spring morning in May 1917. Little Barbara, who was only 4 years old at the time, toddled into the bedroom to wake her mother up. Despite the innocent calls and the desperate shakes, Edna never opened her eyes again. The three-year-old mother had died suddenly. Official medical reports cited the cause as suffocation due to mastoiditis, but the women in high society at the time whispered a much more tragic story. They believed Edna had taken poison to commit suicide, her heart shattered by the unbearable coldness and public affairs of her husband. The power and money of the two families quickly shut down any investigation, and no autopsy was ever performed. For that 4-year-old girl, her mother's death was a permanently bleeding wound. It planted a cruel early lesson in her fragile soul. Family money could silence the world, but it could not keep the life of the person whose warmth she craved the most. Instead of holding his little daughter to soothe her pain, Franklin Hutton pushed her away like a nuisance. Busy with million-dollar deals and beautiful young mistresses, he left his daughter to be raised by her grandparents in a massive 60-room mansion on Long Island. Here, wealth appeared like a cold ghost. The little girl dined alone at endlessly long tables under the lifeless gazes of an army of servants. Her grandmother suffered from dementia, spending her days rocking in a white wicker chair, completely forgetting the presence of her poor granddaughter. Her grandfather, Frank Woolworth, though he lovingly called her his princess, was also sinking into the delusions of old age. Surrounded by emptiness, Barbara began to form a cruel habit that would later destroy her entire life, using material things to trade for attention. Sent to prestigious boarding schools for high society ladies, and realizing she was isolated by her classmates, the little girl took her expensive pearl necklaces, rubies, and designer dolls to give away in exchange for fake smiles. It was a cruel and bitter transaction, The other children did not look at Barbara as a friend, but as a gold mine to be exploited. At age 12, when her grandmother passed away, an inheritance of $26.1 million automatically fell into her hands. Combined with $2.1 million from her late mother's trust, the growing teenager reluctantly became the target of countless greedy eyes. An old butler once sadly patted the 9-year-old girl on the head, quietly warning her that this wealth would only attract men who wanted to marry her for money. That prophecy was terrifyingly accurate. By 1933, when Barbara turned 21, thanks to her father's investments in the stock market, the fortune had swollen to $42 million, not even counting her late mother's fund. She officially stepped onto the throne as one of the richest women on the planet. But that throne was built on a shattered psychological foundation, a young woman carrying the fear of abandonment, always haunted by her mother's corpse, and naively believing that all attention in the world must be paid for in dollars. The nightmare of America's poor little rich girl was truly just beginning. In 1930, Barbara Hutton turned 18 and officially entered the glamorous high society of New York. Following the tradition of aristocratic families, her father, Franklin Hutton, decided to throw a debutante ball for his daughter, but he chose the timing with cruel ignorance. America that year was sinking into the dark shadow of the Great Depression. The entire nation was exhausted. Millions of desperate workers lined up on freezing streets just to get a piece of relief bread. Fathers and mothers swallowed their tears watching their children starve, while countless families lost their homes. Right in the midst of that supreme historical tragedy, Barbara's debutante ball defiantly took place at the prestigious Ritz-Carlton Hotel, costing an astounding $60,000, a massive fortune, at a time when an average American family barely survived on spare cents. The scale of that party still makes people shudder at its ostentation today. There were 4 symphony orchestras playing through the night to entertain the dancing guests. A staff of 200 professional servers constantly poured 2,000 bottles of premium champagne. At exactly midnight, 1,000 extravagant midnight meals featuring 7 courses were served, followed by 1,000 lavish breakfasts. World-famous actor Maurice Chevalier was paid to dress up as Santa Claus, standing and smiling to welcome powerful guests from families like the Astors or the Rockefellers. Most insanely, every guest received a small souvenir box upon leaving, containing unset diamonds, emeralds, rubies, and sapphires. The image of the radiant Miss Barbara in a fluffy ball gown and diamond earrings instantly flooded the front pages of every newspaper across the country. The absurdly grotesque contrast between insane luxury and millions of people slowly dying of poverty ignited a wave of ultimate outrage. Public opinion boiled over. The press sarcastically dubbed her the poor little rich girl, a mocking label that would cling to her until she went to the grave. Musician Cole Porter wrote a satirical song titled Poor Little Rich Girl, while film studios rushed to make comedies mocking her lifestyle. They hated her. They turned her into the symbol of everything terrible and unjust about America's elite. But the angry masses outside did not know that the tone-deaf party was the work of her father, Franklin Hutton. He wanted to show off the family's prestige, unintentionally pushing his little 18-year-old daughter to become the shield for the hatred of an entire nation. Later, Barbara bitterly described herself as the most hated girl in America. The fear of public opinion and the guilt deeply embedded in her mind made her even more unstable, desperately seeking a peaceful anchor. But when a woman carries a wound too large and a purse too full in her heart, she often attracts predators. In 1933, turning 21, with full access to tens of millions of dollars, Barbara naively believed she would use her sincere heart to find true love. She met Prince Alexis Mdivani, a man from an exiled Georgian royal bloodline. He was charming, handsome, and sophisticated, exactly the way ruined European aristocrats at the time used to mesmerize rich and gullible American girls. Barbara was completely blinded. She told herself that a man with a royal title, coming from a prestigious background, would surely come to her for love and not for money. She was painfully wrong. Alexis and his brothers were actually professional gold diggers, notorious in European high society. They considered marrying American heiresses a lucrative career, draining the assets of lonely women and then leaving with massive divorce settlements. To trap his prey named Barbara, Alexis used a despicable plot. He dragged his ex-wife and a cunning woman named Russi Surt into the scheme. Russi pretended to befriend Barbara, using sweetness to win the trust of the motherless girl, then constantly poured honeyed words about Alexis into her ears. When Barbara started sensing something was wrong and hesitated to back out, Russi immediately turned on her. She threatened to release smearing information so the press would tear Barbara's image apart again if she dared to refuse the marriage. The terror of public gossip since her 18th birthday party threw Barbara into a panic. She fell entirely into the trap. In the summer of 1933, the 20-year-old Barbara Hutton walked down the aisle in magnificent Paris, taking the prince's arm with the hope of a peaceful haven. But the most painful tragedy in a woman's life struck right at her most fragile moment. On their wedding night, instead of sweet words of affection, the prince who had passionately courted her looked straight at his new bride and coldly delivered a cruel judgment. "You are too fat." Those words were as sharp as a knife, shredding the heart of a girl who always craved to be loved. It shattered the little self-esteem she had left. For a woman, there is no pain more bitter than being body-shamed by her own husband on their wedding night. From that fateful night on, the ghost of insecurity permanently swallowed Barbara. She became obsessed with her weight, punishing herself with the harshest diets. The gold digger's insult triggered severe anorexia nervosa, a disease that would ravage her body and torment her for decades to come. The marriage was a hell from the very start. They separated almost immediately after the honeymoon. Alexis had achieved his ultimate goal: free access to a massive fortune. He threw money at sports cars, estates, jewelry, and whatever he desired. Meanwhile, Barbara, in her pitiful desperation, bit her lip and paid for everything. She blindly believed that if she just gave him enough money, if she met all his material demands, he would eventually grant her a little bit of love. But love is something that can never be bought with submission. In 1935, after just 2 years of humiliating cohabitation, they divorced. Alexis walked away with a massive settlement, leaving behind a wife physically and mentally exhausted. The title of princess that Barbara wore was ultimately just an empty cloak. At age 22, she had fully tasted the bitterness of being used, exploited, and ruthlessly thrown away. Stepping out of her first marriage at age 22, Barbara Hutton carried a torn soul, but became more desperately eager than ever to find true love. The heart of a deeply wounded woman is often very blind. Almost immediately, she rushed into a new marriage. This time, it was Count Kurt Heinrich Eberhard Erdmann Georg von Haugwitz, Hardenberg Reventlow, a Danish aristocrat with an impressively long name, but an empty bank account. Unlike the cruel coldness of her first husband, this count appeared incredibly attentive, seemingly truly caring for her fragile emotions. They married in 1935. But there was a detail that left the press and attendees shuddering with unease. On the biggest day of a girl's life, instead of choosing pure white, Barbara walked down the aisle in a pitch-black silk dress, wearing a sorrowful veiled hat and a dark fur coat. That bizarre and gloomy color choice was like a heartbreaking omen, accurately reflecting the desolate, highly insecure, and fearful psychological state tearing her apart inside. In 1936, a rare, warm ray of light shone into Barbara's dark life when she gave birth to her only child, a son named Lance Reventlow. For a brief period, people saw the lonely billionaire seemingly touch true happiness. She had a husband, an adorable child, a golden opportunity to build the normal family she had never experienced for a single day during her childhood. She poured money into building Winfield House, a spectacular and majestic mansion in Regent's Park in London. The house cost a massive fortune, like every frivolous thing Barbara ever touched, but she didn't care. To her at that moment, money was nothing compared to the dream of a complete family. However, the Danish count hid cold calculations behind his caring facade. He was morbidly obsessed with his wife's massive fortune, and particularly terrified of where that cash flow would go if Barbara unfortunately passed away. Under US law at the time, the inheritance tax levied on her assets could reach 2/3. To protect the money bag he constantly craved, Reventlow used sweet psychological manipulation, convincing Barbara to do something that shocked and outraged America, even more than the extravagant party years ago. In 1938, listening to her husband's instigation, Barbara Hutton officially signed the papers to renounce her American citizenship. She believed this act was simply to ease the tax burden and preserve family assets. But in reality, it was Reventlow's sinister chess move to ensure that if his sickly wife died, the entire billion-dollar fortune would belong to him and his son, without the US government taking a single dime. The decision to abandon her homeland dealt a fatal blow to Barbara's image. The backlash erupted immediately and was incredibly toxic. Millions of poor American workers had shopped at Woolworth stores, and their blood, sweat, and tear-soaked 5 and 10-cent coins had helped build the fortune Barbara was enjoying. Yet now, she heartlessly turned her back on the country that created her family's prosperity. Journalist Walter Winchell, one of the most powerful figures in American media at the time, publicly called her the most arrogant child of the elite. Major newspapers competed to call her despicable, describing her as an ungrateful traitor, taking millions of hard-earned dollars from the poor to feed a foreign man. The ruthless hammer of public opinion crashed down, completely breaking Barbara. She had lost her homeland and permanently lost the forgiveness of the American people. The calculating marriage with Reventlow eventually crumbled and officially ended in 1941. But this divorce brought another heartbreaking pain: the custody battle for her young son Lance. Although Barbara eventually won the case and kept custody, the process exposed a cruel and tragic truth about generational trauma. Barbara realized she was completely empty, possessing no maternal instincts whatsoever. How could a woman who grew up without a mother, unloved by her father, know how to embrace a child? Exactly like how her father Franklin had treated her, Barbara coldly handed the upbringing of her only son over to teams of tutors and expensive boarding schools. She was too drowned in her own pain, too desperate in her race to find romantic love, to provide her son with a stable family home. When the dark clouds of World War II covered Europe, Barbara sadly packed her bags and moved back to California. In an effort to salvage her image and make amends with her homeland, she donated the magnificent Winfield House to the British Armed Forces for wartime use. She donated massive sums of money, gave her personal yacht to the Royal Navy, and used her fame to promote war bonds. Right in the cinematic capital of Hollywood, fate compensated her with a rare man who did not crave the Woolworth fortune. Actor Cary Grant, one of the most attractive and powerful movie stars in the world, walked into her life in 1942. He was handsome, successful, brilliantly radiant, and most importantly, he had a massive fortune of his own. He did not need Barbara's dollars. They threw a romantic wedding on the 8th of July, 1942. The bitter press immediately gave them the sarcastic nickname Cash and Carrie, implying that the actor also married her for money. But Cary Grant proved the opposite. He firmly refused to sign a prenuptial agreement, wanting to prove to the world that he came to Barbara with a pure heart and sincere love. For a time, everything seemed to smile upon the heavily scarred woman. They walked together at movie premieres, hosted cozy parties, and lived a glamorous life fitting for one of Hollywood's most powerful couples. But sadly, the deep psychological wounds inside Barbara could not heal themselves just because a good man appeared. Cary Grant was a star at the peak of his career, working constantly and frequently away from home. The feeling of neglect resurfaced, awakening the ghosts of loneliness from her childhood. Barbara turned back to the things that always dragged her down into the abyss of despair: frantic shopping sprees, all-night parties, and hard liquor. She sank deep into a severe addiction to sedatives, having to take pills to force herself to sleep, and then taking more pills to wake up and cope with endless bouts of depression. The vicious anorexia stemming from the insult on her first wedding night continued to destroy her fragile body. Barbara grew sickly and emaciated, her health declining rapidly. No matter how much he loved her, Cary Grant was powerless against that self-destruction. In 1945, after 3 years of living together, they officially divorced. But completely unlike the gold diggers before, Cary Grant walked out of her life without demanding a single dime. He left her fortune completely intact, exactly as it was the day they met. Moreover, he maintained a beautiful friendship with her for many years afterward, and always reached out to act as a forgiving father figure to young Lance. Decades later, Barbara sadly admitted that out of all the men who passed through her life, Cary Grant was the only husband she deeply loved. But the tragedy of this woman was that, even when she found true love, her soul was too decayed to hold on to it. After Cary Grant left, the gates to hell of her subsequent terrible marriages slowly opened again. The departure of Cary Grant left a permanent, unfillable void in Barbara Hutton's soul. Losing the only man who loved her unconditionally, she was like a ship without a steering wheel, spiraling out of control into whirlwind marriages and endless addictions. She craved to be healed, but sought the antidote in the most toxic places. In 1948, Barbara married her fourth husband, Prince Igor Trubetskoy. He was an exiled Russian aristocrat, a master race car driver for Ferrari, with tight finances but immense fame. The marriage initially carried flickering rays of hope. She accompanied him to notorious racetracks, trying to play the role of a solid, supportive wife. But the old script cruelly repeated itself. Lifestyle differences and psychological instability choked the marriage after only 3 years of living together. When they officially divorced in 1951, the world shuddered to witness the ultimate collapse of the female billionaire. She was so desperate that she tried to end her own life. Instead of receiving pity, that supreme agony was immediately splashed across the front pages of every newspaper. Photographers swarmed like insects outside her hotel. Reporters constantly harassed her with phone calls digging for information. The sorrow of a betrayed woman became cheap entertainment for the public, sensational material that helped tabloids sell like hotcakes. The poor little rich girl was collapsing, shattering right before the curious eyes of millions. Empty, isolated, and desperate, Barbara used money like an anesthetic to escape reality. She frantically threw money at luxury items far beyond the imagination of even the richest billionaires. She owned countless mansions spanning the globe, from Paris and Tangier to dreamy estates across Europe. Each property was maintained by a massive army of servants, butlers, and gardeners, always on standby, consuming massive sums of money every month, regardless of whether she visited or not. Her jewelry collection became an ironically legendary tale. She once bought priceless emeralds that belonged to a duchess of the Russian Romanov royal family. She demanded top jewelers craft them into a magnificent solid gold tiara, creating one of the most expensive pieces of jewelry ever privately owned. But later in life, when she hit a dead end and her assets depleted, she had to bitterly sell that tiara. It was dismantled, every gem torn apart to be sold for profit, exactly the way her life was torn apart by men. Barbara shopped like a sleepwalker. At the boutique of legendary designer Cristobal Balenciaga, she enjoyed unprecedented privileges. While other wealthy ladies were strictly limited to buying a few pieces per season, Barbara was ready to swipe her card to buy 20, 30, or even 40 expensive outfits in a single visit. She bought them unconsciously, only for those magnificent dresses to hang silently in gigantic closets, tags fully intact, never worn even once. More insanely, she was willing to give away expensive supercars or tip thousands of dollars to any stranger who showed her even a little bit of kindness. She tossed gemstones at flatterers around her, like handing out candy, naively believing that if she gave enough, someone would stay and love her. Designer Oleg Cassini later sadly recalled that Cary Grant once desperately came to him, begging him to intervene and save Barbara, but all efforts were futile because she had sunk too deep into the mud of insecurity and drug addiction. And then, the most ironic marriage tragedy occurred in 1953. If there is one story that most clearly proves the failure of using money to buy love, it is her fifth marriage to Porfirio Rubirosa. He was an internationally notorious playboy, a seasoned predator specializing in digging gold from rich and lonely women. Their wedding was a ridiculous and suffocatingly sad play. Female journalist Phyllis Battelle, while reporting on the ceremony that day, left behind a sentence that truly captured the tragedy of a human life. The bride, at her fifth wedding, wore black and carried a glass of liquor. Imagine a 41-year-old woman entering her fifth marriage, showing up on her own happy day in a mourning black dress, her eyes glazed from intoxication, tightly clutching a glass of scotch. That is not the image of a bride looking for happiness. That is the image of a woman who has given up, executing a contract trading flesh and money in utter despair. That insane marriage ended after a mere 53 days. In exchange for 53 days as the wife of a serial cheater, Barbara had to wipe her tears and pay Rubirosa a divorce settlement of $3.5 million, along with a B-25 bomber converted into a luxury private jet. The pitiful billionaire was essentially just a giant ATM funding the pleasures and secret affairs of the world's biggest playboy. The shards of her soul continued to embed themselves in her life in the following years. In 1955, she married for the sixth time to Baron Gottfried von Cramm, a German tennis star and also an old friend. One might think long-standing familiarity would bring peace, but after 4 years together, Barbara completely broke down when she discovered her husband was bisexual. This deception smashed the last remaining bit of faith she had in fidelity. They divorced in 1959. To cover up that humiliating pain, she poured money into building a massive Japanese-style palace on a 30-acre estate in Mexico. She imported top artisans, bringing the most luxurious materials from the land of cherry blossoms. The majestic house rose proudly into the blue sky, but inside it was cold and lifeless. She had the power to create the most beautiful spaces in the world, but would never have the ability to fill them with love. By 1964, at age 52, Barbara closed her eyes and stepped into her seventh marriage, and also the last of her life, with Raymond Doan Vinnar Champassak. This time, she didn't even bother hiding the truth. She literally used money to buy a royal title for the man, turning an ordinary artist into a prince just to satisfy her habit of collecting aristocratic titles. This highly transactional marriage barely survived for 2 years before shattering. At age 54, Barbara Hutton returned to absolute isolation, 7 times a bride, 7 times standing in divorce court. Cruel men had teamed up to drain and tear apart her fortune, leaving behind a ruined middle-aged woman with no husband, no ray of hope, only a long, painful slide toward death. The final years of Barbara Hutton's life are a heartbreaking indictment of human greed and the cruelty of fate. Her massive fortune was not only drained by 7 husbands, but also torn apart by the very people paid to protect her. Financial advisors, the trustees managing her remaining money, exploited the billionaire's psychological collapse to make shady investments and ruthlessly line their own pockets. They knew perfectly well that Barbara was too deep into addiction and melancholy to be lucid enough to control her assets. She was surrounded by a flock of stalking vultures, from strange flatterers to unscrupulous managers. And painfully, that entire tragic downfall happened right in front of the eyes of Lance Reventlow, her only son. Lance had grown up in a mess. He had to watch the mother whose love he craved constantly wear wedding dresses and then drag herself to divorce court. He saw her drown in addictions, self-harming starvation, and endless sorrow. Despite a turbulent childhood, or perhaps because of the haunting tragedy of his mother's life, Lance tried his hardest to live a different life. He became a professional race car driver, proudly following in the footsteps of his stepfather, Igor Trubetskoy. He married, had a son, and burned with the desire to build a normal home, a warm family that his mother could never permanently achieve. However, fate seemed determined to strip everything from the woman named Barbara. On the 24th of July, 1972, devastating news struck like a hammer, smashing the last remaining fragment in her soul. The plane carrying Lance crashed into a mountain near Aspen, Colorado. He died suddenly when he was only 36 years old. Her only son, her only flesh and blood on earth, the man who was supposed to outlive her and burn incense for her when she was laid to rest, had now turned to ashes. The pain of a white-haired parent burying a young child was too brutal of a blow. From that moment on, Barbara Hutton was truly dead, even though her body still weakly breathed. The rare friends who visited her described a chillingly haunting scene. The woman who was once the beauty icon of America's elite was now just a fading ghost. She buried herself in bed, hiding from the sunlight, chain-smoking, and drinking only Coca-Cola to maintain a flicker of energy. Anorexia had completely swallowed her. Designer Oleg Cassini, when visiting her in her final days, could not hide his shock. He sadly recounted that Barbara was so emaciated, she was essentially just a skeleton covered in skin. Her spirit was dead. Vitality had permanently left her. She wandered like a ghost, haunting the luxury suites of hotels where she spent her final years in terrifying silence. By the mid-1970s, the billion-dollar financial empire officially collapsed. Barbara Hutton was bankrupt. The massive inheritance had evaporated into the mansions she never lived in, the jewels she rarely wore, and the cruel men who looted everything they could carry. The girl who was once the richest on the planet now had less than $3,500 in her bank account. On the 11th of May, 1979, Barbara Hutton suffered a heart attack in a room at the Four Seasons Hotel in Los Angeles. She took her last breath at age 66. History closed the life of a female billionaire in the most lonely and dismal way. When she closed her eyes, not a single blood relative was by her side. There was no husband to hold her frail hand. There was no soulmate crying in the next room. The funeral of the woman who used to host parties for thousands of guests, who was the wife of European princes and Hollywood superstars, who once owned one of the greatest fortunes in American history, had exactly 16 people in attendance. Only 16 people came to send off a life full of tears. Her body was quietly brought back to be buried in the Woolworth family mausoleum at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. There, she was laid to rest, right next to Edna, the short-lived mother whose frozen corpse she had terrifyingly discovered when she was 4 years old. The circle of tragedy was officially closed. The poor little rich girl, after a lifetime of being lost, finally returned to lie in her mother's arms. Looking back at the tear-soaked life of Barbara Hutton, many financial experts still use her story as a cautionary tale about setting up trusts and protecting heirs. They argue that her grandfather, Frank Woolworth, could have perfectly designed a strict financial mechanism to protect his granddaughter from her own impulsiveness and from the gold diggers circling like sharks. But those dry analyses completely miss the deepest root of the tragedy. Money was never Barbara's real problem. The starvation of affection was the fatal stab. Remember that 4-year-old girl facing her mother's frozen corpse. Think of a child emotionally rejected and abandoned by her biological father. She grew up in prestigious boarding schools and massive but empty castles, raised by paid employees instead of the warm embraces of family. Her massive wealth turned her into a target practice for exploitation, but it was the absence of sincere love from the moment she was born that shattered her soul. 7 whirlwind marriages, frantic shopping sprees, diamonds scattered to strangers, all were just the desperate cries for help from a woman looking for something she never had. She craved someone who would love her unconditionally, someone who would hold her hand not because of the Woolworth name or the $1 million checks, but because she was just an ordinary woman named Barbara. She had enough money to buy everything in this world, but was powerless against the things money couldn't buy. The poor little rich girl died in material destitution, but the emotional poverty was what killed her every single day throughout her 66 years of existence. The greatest lesson her life leaves behind is not found in bank statements. It lies in a simple but incredibly harsh truth. Money can build magnificent palaces, but it cannot buy a home. It can buy expensive wedding dresses, but it cannot buy fidelity. It can buy luxury, but it cannot heal the scarred traumas of childhood. And sometimes, being born with everything in your hands means you have to close your eyes with absolutely nothing left. If this story brings you profound insights, please hit like and subscribe to the channel so we can continue to accompany each other in the next emotional historical stories.